The fluorescent lights of Oak Creek Memorial's ICU hummed at a frequency that would drive most people mad after an hour. Sarah Chen had stopped hearing it 3 years ago. She refilled the sanitizer dispenser at 11 p.m. with hands that moved through the task like they'd done it 10,000 times before, which they had, her fingers steady on the pump mechanism even though something deeper in her chest was pulling tight. Her name badge hung backward on her scrubs, turned inward against her collarbone where no one could read it, and the scrubs themselves hung 2 sizes too large, the kind of deliberate concealment that made her invisible. Perfect. Invisible was what she'd come to Oak Creek for. Invisible was safe. The ICU smelled like antiseptic cutting through recycled air, that particular combination of bleach and hand sanitizer and something underneath that never quite washed out, the smell of bodies fighting death in climate-controlled rooms where the outside world couldn't touch you. Sarah inhaled it like some people inhaled ocean air. Familiar. Almost like coming home, which was the problem. Home was supposed to be something you left behind. Home was supposed to stay buried. She moved between the beds with the economy of motion that only comes from muscle memory, from years of doing this work in places where wasted movement meant wasted oxygen. Her shoes made no sound on the tile floor. She'd learned long ago to move like the building was sleeping and she didn't want to wake it. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm in the semi-darkness, monitors casting everything in the color of drowned light. Most of the ICU patients were unconscious. Most didn't know their names would appear in discharge summaries. Most would never understand that the person wiping their forearms with cool washcloths at midnight was running on fumes and medication she picked up at a pharmacy 20 miles away under her sister's insurance. Room 12 held a Marine. She knew this before she looked at the chart. You could always tell a military patient, something in the way they lay, even unconscious, like their body remembered what discipline meant. Sepsis protocol. The numbers on his monitor told the story: heart rate elevated, temperature spiking, white cell count through the ceiling. His name was Staff Sergeant Dylan Reeves, and Sarah's breathing stopped for exactly 2 seconds when she saw his face. Ramadi. 2009, the firefight in Jolin district where her son had taken shrapnel in the left leg and thermal burns across his back. Her son had come home. Dylan Reeves had been the kind of officer who didn't leave Marines behind, the kind who counted heads before he counted his own injuries. She remembered her son saying the name once, years later, after the physical therapy and the nightmares, "Skipper kept us moving. We would have bled out if the skipper hadn't kept us moving." Sarah's hands paused on the chart. She looked at the face on the pillow. Older now, worn down by whatever had brought him to Savannah and into this bed, but unmistakable. She counted to 4 in her head. This was the technique: 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. She'd learned it in field hospitals when the incoming fire was close enough to taste. Then she opened her eyes and refocused on the 4 line, on the saline bag, on the perfectly calibrated drip rate that was keeping him alive until his immune system could catch up with the sepsis ravaging his blood. The door opened at 11:23 p.m. Dr. Marcus Hargrove entered like he owned the air molecules, white coat pristine despite being halfway through a 12-hour shift, already talking before he was through the threshold. His presence had a way of making the ICU feel smaller, like the walls were leaning in to listen to his opinions about what should happen next. "Reeves is responding to second-line empiric coverage," Hargrove said, not to Sarah but to the room generally, to the universe that revolved around his interpretations. His voice carried the particular confidence of a man who'd never once questioned whether he was right. "We're looking at a 40 to 60% recovery trajectory with standard protocol." Sarah continued adjusting the drip, her movements precise as surgical instruments. She could read a chart in her peripheral vision. She knew Reeves' creatinine was climbing. She knew his lactate was borderline. She knew that the dosage Hargrove had written, the one now hanging on the 4-pole, was aggressive enough to save a life but dangerous enough to destroy one if the timing wasn't perfect. The elderly woman in the corner chair, Reeves' mother, probably, leaned forward. "Is he going to be okay, doctor?" Hargrove smiled with the kind of gentleness he reserved for moments when he could afford to be kind. "Your son is receiving the best care available. The medications we're using are state-of-the-art. You can trust me." He said it like trust was something he kept in his pocket, something he could distribute to people who believed that a white coat meant infallibility. Sarah's jaw tightened. Not visible. Just a small thing, an internal shift. She turned to leave, her work in the room finished. Nurse. Hargrove's voice snapped across the room like a whip. A word. She turned back. In the fluorescent light, her face was composed as still water. She waited for him to continue, a posture of complete deference, the kind of posture that said I am here to serve with every muscle in her body. This was the mask she wore at Oak Creek. This was Sarah Chen, the night shift nurse, the one who asked questions that weren't her place to ask, the one who didn't belong to the hierarchy that kept men like Hargrove insulated at the top. The dosage concern you raised about the empiric coverage. He said it without preamble, without lowering his voice, speaking loud enough for Reeves' mother and his younger sister to hear clearly. That was an overreach. You're a nurse. A talented one, I'll grant you, but fundamentally you lack the education and credentials to second-guess medication protocols written by an attending physician. What you did this morning was question my medical judgment in front of the patient's family. That's insubordination. The room had that quality of hush that comes before something worse happens. His mother's face shifted. His sister's hand went to her mouth. Hargrove's eyes never left Sarah's, and in them was something she recognized, a man who needed other people to acknowledge his supremacy the way plants need sunlight. Sarah didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't shift her weight or cross her arms or show any of the physical tells that would give him satisfaction. She stood with her shoulders square and her hands at her sides, the picture of professional acceptance. When she spoke, her voice came out at a volume meant only for him to hear. Even though they both knew his mother and sister were listening, I questioned a dosage that fell outside the standard parameters for his renal function. My concern was patient safety. Your concern was overstepping. Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. It won't happen again. I'd hate for your personnel file to reflect insubordination. Understand? Understood, Doctor. 2 words. Clipped. Professional. Empty of everything except acknowledgement. He nodded, satisfied, and turned to leave. Then, at the doorway, he paused. You're in good health for your age, by the way. It would be a shame if a disciplinary action made your position here complicated. Something to think about. The door closed behind him. Sarah stood motionless for 30 seconds. The ventilator wheezed. The monitors beeped their rhythmic confirmation of heartbeat and oxygen saturation. In room 12, Staff Sergeant Reeves breathed in the unconscious way of the dying, and his mother was looking at Sarah with a confusion that suggested she'd just watched someone smaller absorb a blow meant to break them. Sarah left the room. The hallway outside the ICU was empty at 11:34 p.m., the kind of empty that feels deliberate in a hospital. She walked toward the break room, her pace unhurried, her breathing controlled. The overhead fluorescent lights cast everything in that same drowned color. She could feel Hargrove before she heard him, that particular quality of air pressure change that comes when a certain kind of person enters a space. She turned. He was there, 20 feet back, and his phone was in his hand. His thumbs were moving across the screen with purpose. You did well in there, he said, not looking up. Taking it quietly. That shows some sense. He sent the text and looked at her. But you need to understand something about Oak Creek. About how this institution works. We have people on the board. People who listen to me. People who have disposable nurses and keep the ones who understand their place. Sarah met his eyes without flinching. She let him have the moment where he thought he was winning, where he thought his institutional power and his white coat and his connections to people who mattered gave him dominion over someone like her. She let one tear slide down her left cheek. Just one. Deliberate. Controlled. She didn't wipe it away. She let it sit there, the picture of wounded acceptance. When she spoke, her voice came out like still water. I've survived worse than you, Doctor. She said it without inflection. Without anger or threat or defensiveness. Just a statement of fact. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps making no sound on the tile, the overhead lights flickering in her wake like they were tired of everything they'd witnessed. Hargrove stood in the hallway for 12 seconds. His jaw clenched. He looked down at his phone, at the text he'd already sent to someone on the board's executive committee, and his thumbs moved across the screen again. * She's become a liability. Recommend we move forward with the plan we discussed. *. He understood something in that moment, even if he couldn't articulate it. He understood that quiet competence was more threatening than any objection. He understood that a woman who could absorb a public humiliation without cracking was the kind of woman who could eventually overshadow him. And he understood, on some level below language, that he needed to move fast. What Hargrove didn't understand, what none of them understood at Oak Creek Memorial, was that Sarah Chen had survived things that would have scattered lesser people across multiple time zones. She had survived Ramadi. She had survived the nightmares. She had survived the moment she decided to walk away from the only thing that had ever made sense to her, back when the screaming in her sleep had become loud enough to wake the neighbors. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in exactly 72 hours, Staff Sergeant Dylan Reeves was going to stop breathing for real, and Sarah was going to have to choose between following the protocols of a man who wanted her gone or saving the life of the Marine who'd once saved her son. The break room smelled like stale coffee and regret. Sarah sat alone at the corner table with her thermos, the one her daughter had given her 3 years ago, chipped around the rim, the handle wrapped in athletic tape because the ceramic had splintered. She poured the tea with steady hands, watched steam rise in the fluorescent light, and did not think about the way Dr. Hargrove's voice had carried through room 12 like a blade. The vending machine hummed its mechanical song. 2:07 a.m. Most hospitals felt alive at night, but Oak Creek Memorial's ICU at this hour felt like a tomb with fluorescent lighting. Jenna arrived at 2:11 with Marcus and Beth, all three gathered their shift bags in a cluster near the lockers. Their conversation died the moment Sarah looked up. Not because she was watching them, she wasn't, but because they felt the weight of her attention the way prey animals sense a predator's gaze. Jenna said something to Marcus, something quiet about the day shift schedule. Marcus laughed, the sound hollow and forced. They moved toward the door like schoolchildren leaving a classroom where the teacher is angry. None of them said goodbye to Sarah. None of them said anything at all. The vending machine hummed louder in their absence, filling the silence with the white noise of a failing compressor. Sarah's tea cooled in her lap. She'd learned to drink it at any temperature years ago, in places where hot water was a luxury and you took what you were given. The thermos had a dent on the left side from when her son had dropped it at Fort Lezun, back when he was still a lance corporal, back before Ramadi, back when she could still pretend her medical work was limited to garrison clinics and routine checkups. That was before everything became tactical. Before she became someone who needed to hide. At 6:45 a.m., when the day shift arrived and the unit board near the elevator filled with the usual detritus of departmental life, schedules, reminders, shift updates, Sarah walked past the cork board and saw her name in bold black text. The incident report had been laminated. Someone had taken the time to laminate it, which meant someone upstairs had wanted it to last, to stay visible, to accumulate the weight of repeated observation. Disciplinary action, Sarah Chen, RN. Insubordination. Failure to respect chain of command. Questioning physician orders without cause. Pattern of disruptive behavior. Her right hand trembled, so she gripped her stethoscope until her knuckles went white. The metal earpieces bit into her palm. One of the day shift nurses, Kelly, who'd been friendly enough at the Christmas party, took a photograph of the report. Not discreetly. The flash on her phone was audible in the quiet hallway. Sarah kept walking. She could feel the weight of eyes on her back, that particular sensation of social exile that humans had perfected thousands of years ago and hadn't improved since. It wasn't violence. It wasn't loud. It was just the systematic removal of acknowledgement, as if Sarah had become invisible except for the fact that she was being very, very carefully seen. In the supply closet, alone among the boxes of sterile gauze and the small bottles of medication, one tear slid down her cheek. She did not let it become two. She wiped it with the back of her wrist and took for measured breaths, the kind she'd taken in Ramadi when incoming fire had pinned her unit down in a half-collapsed compound. The kind that brought you back to yourself. Brought you back to the part of you that remembered how to function when everything around you was trying to destroy you. She returned to work. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. The mask was back in place, the one she'd constructed 3 years ago when she'd walked away from the Navy SEALs medical division and taken a job in a mid-sized Georgia hospital where nobody knew her name, where she could be nobody, where she could heal in the dark without anyone asking questions about the scars or the nightmares or the way she sometimes woke up at 3 a.m. with her hand around someone's throat before she realized she was in a civilian bed in a civilian apartment with nobody there but her own ghosts. She'd chosen the night shift deliberately. Fewer people. Fewer conversations. Fewer chances for someone to ask the question that would unravel everything. Where did you work before this? Because if they asked that, she'd have to lie, and if she had to lie consistently, eventually someone would pull the thread. And once that thread came undone, the whole careful architecture of her invisibility would collapse. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen did not exist anymore. That woman had bled out in field hospitals and helicopter landing zones and the kinds of places that didn't show up on official maps. The woman who remained was just a nurse. Quiet. Competent. Unremarkable. The kind of woman people didn't notice, which meant the kind of woman people didn't have to fear. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that right now, 72 hours away, in a bed in room 12, Staff Sergeant Dylan Reeves was going to start crashing. His sepsis was already progressing with the quiet determination of a snake through grass. His kidney function was sliding downward because of the medication dosage that Dr. Hargrove had prescribed, the dosage that Sarah had been humiliated for questioning. The dosage that was going to do exactly what she'd predicted it would do. And when that happened, when his body began to fail, Sarah was going to have to choose between following the protocols of a man who wanted her disappeared or saving the life of the Marine who had once commanded her son in the streets of Ramadi. She thought about this while charting medications at the nurse's station at 3:41 a.m. She thought about it while making rounds at 5:15 a.m. She thought about it during the handoff report at 6:50 a.m., while Dr. Hargrove was nowhere to be found, which was unusual, which meant he was somewhere, doing something, making something happen. The moment she could feel coming had a weight to it, the way the air changes before a storm. In Ramadi, they'd called this feeling the waiting. The time between knowing something bad was coming and the moment it actually arrived. Some people froze in the waiting. Some people tried to outrun it. Sarah had learned a long time ago to stand absolutely still and let it come to her, because the worst thing you could do was move. Movement caught attention. Attention meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant death. At 2:24 a.m., exactly 72 hours after Dr. Hargrove's public humiliation, though Sarah wouldn't think about the cosmic timing until much later, the monitor in room 12 screamed. Not the slow, steady rhythm of alarm fatigue. A sharp, urgent wail that cut through the quiet ICU like a siren through fog. Sarah's head snapped up from the medication reconciliation she'd been doing. She was moving before the second alarm tone, her body remembering the choreography of emergency before her mind even caught up. Staff Sergeant Reeves was grey, a color that human skin wasn't supposed to be, and his blood pressure was dropping like a stone down a well, 80/40, then 70/35, then lower. His heart rate was climbing, his respiration shallow, his oxygen saturation plummeting because his heart couldn't pump against the pressure that was building inside his chest. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid crushing the heart muscle like a fist in a wet cloth. Dr. Kim, the on-call resident, stood at the bedside with an ultrasound wand trembling in his hand like a divining rod in the hands of someone who'd never believed in water. He was 26 years old, 8 weeks out of medical school, and he had only ever seen this in simulation labs where the mannequins didn't die if you froze. I've only seen this in simulation, he said, and his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Sarah was already positioning Reeves, already exposing his chest, already counting ribs under her fingertips. Her voice came out calm and absolute, the voice of someone who had done this before, who had done this under conditions that would have killed the normal human being standing across from her. Call for a pericardiocentesis kit. Now. Kim stared at her like she'd spoken another language. His heart is being crushed. The kit. Now. Someone, it might have been the night tech, it might have been anyone, moved. The kit arrived. Sarah's hands didn't shake as she prepped the area with betadine, her movements muscle memory from field hospitals in Kandahar where she'd done this with shelling in the background and sand in her teeth, and the knowledge that if she hesitated even once, the Marine on the table in front of her would die on the table in front of her. She took the 14-gauge needle, felt its familiar weight in her palm, guided it between his ribs toward the left shoulder. Counting spaces. Feeling for landmarks that muscle memory had burned into her nervous system so thoroughly that her hands could do this in the dark. Dark blood filled the syringe. Not the bright arterial blood of accident, the wrong kind of blood. The effusion. The crushing weight. Reeves gasped. His oxygen saturation climbed. His blood pressure rose. His heart rate dropped from the zone of imminent death into something that might keep him alive long enough to get to surgery. For minutes and 22 seconds. She stepped back, and Dr. Kim stared at her like she'd just walked through a wall. His hands were shaking. His face was the color of spoiled milk. Sarah set the syringe down, her own hand steady, her own breathing controlled, and said nothing at all. There was nothing to say. The code had been run. The patient had been saved. The procedure was documented and would be charted with precise medical language: needle decompression of pericardial effusion resulting from post-operative hematoma, immediate resolution of cardiac tamponade, restoration of sinus rhythm, and nobody would need to know that she'd done this for the first time as a civilian in a hospital where she wasn't supposed to exist, wasn't supposed to know how, wasn't supposed to be anything more than the quiet night shift nurse who sometimes asked questions about medication dosages. At 6:13 a.m., Sarah charted the procedure. At 9:15 a.m., Dr. Hargrove arrived early, which never happened. He went directly to the ICU manager's office, and the door closed behind him with the kind of finality that echoed down the hallway. Sarah was still making morning rounds. She heard the door close. She felt it. The waiting had finally arrived. The monitor in room 12 screamed at 2:19 a.m. Not a gentle alarm. Not a polite notification. A high-pitched shriek that cut through the ICU like a siren in a tomb. Sarah's head snapped up from the nurse's station before the second tone finished. She was moving. Not walking. Moving the way muscles remember when they haven't forgotten what urgency costs. The rhythm on the screen was chaos. Blood pressure dropping like a stone in dark water. 68 systolic. 52, 40. Each number a countdown. The on-call resident, some kid named Patterson, maybe 26, maybe fresh enough to still believe sleep would happen tonight, was already at the bedside with an ultrasound machine. His hand shook. The transducer one trembled against the patient's chest like a divining rod searching for water that had already run dry. Sarah could see it from the doorway. Patterson's fingers weren't steady. His jaw wasn't set. His eyes had the blank look of someone whose protocols had left him. Staff Sergeant Dylan Reeves' chest rose and fell with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm. His face was the color of old concrete. Fluid was collecting around his heart. Pressure. Compression. The organ squeezing itself into failure. Sarah pushed past Patterson without apology. Not a request. Not a suggestion. Pericardiocentesis kit. Now. Her voice was calm. Absolute. The kind of calm that comes from having given orders under artillery fire. 18-gauge needle. Syringe. 1% lidocaine. A nurse, Janet, thank God Janet was on tonight, moved. The right kind of move. No questions. No hesitation. Just action. Sarah's hands were already moving. Prepping the chest wall. Finding landmarks. The angle of ribs. The space between them. Her fingers knew this geometry the way musicians know their instruments. This was Kandahar, 2011. This was a forward operating base with mortar rounds walking across the compound. This was a Marine with a sucking chest wound and 180 seconds before his lungs filled with their own blood. The needle went in. Smooth. Precise. Between the 5th and 6th intercostal space, just lateral to the midclavicular line. Her hands didn't shake. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Every part of her locked down tight as a vault. Push. Advance. Feel for the resistance change when the needle breached the pericardium. The syringe drew back. Dark fluid. Not the color you wanted to see. Not the color that meant the patient had time. Got it. Not bragging. Stating fact. The fluid stopped compressing. The pressure released like air escaping from a punctured tire, that small hiss of relief. Reeves' body could breathe again. His heart could beat without the walls crushing it. Monitors climbed. BP stabilized at 94 systolic. O2 sat holding steady at 96. Sinus rhythm. Regular. Strong. A man who had been dying 30 seconds ago was now simply critical. Progress. For minutes. That's all it took. For minutes for Sarah's muscle memory to bridge the distance between night shift nurse and the person she used to be. Patterson was staring at her with something between gratitude and confusion. Janet had that look on her face, the one where someone realizes they just watched a carpenter build a cathedral with a hammer they thought was broken. Get him to surgery for a proper drain, Sarah said to Patterson. Call cardiothoracic. Tell them pericardial effusion, unknown etiology, now stable but needs definitive intervention. She was already stepping back. Already disappearing. Already becoming invisible. But something had shifted in the room. Something invisible but absolute. The kind of shift that comes when someone performs far beyond what their job description allows. By 6:27 a.m., when Sarah was charting the procedure in the computer, her pager buzzed. Director of Nursing Ellen Rodriguez. Administration. Immediately. She knew. Not what, exactly. But she knew the architecture of what came next. She'd been in offices like this before. Offices where the decision had already been made and the conversation was just theater. Dr. Hargrove was already there. He was sitting in the leather chair across from Director Rodriguez. Not the doctor's chair. The power chair. And next to him were two people Sarah didn't recognize, a woman with silver hair and a man with the soft physique of someone who attended meetings more often than they saw patients. Patricia Yost. Gerald Hammond. Board members. Risk management. And a third person standing by the window. David Brennan. His suit cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. His expression had the neutral concern of someone who was about to price a liability. Hargrove turned when she entered. His face arranged itself into worry. Sarah, thank you for coming. Rodriguez gestured to the empty chair. Not the power chair. Never the power chair. We need to discuss the incident with Staff Sergeant Reeves this morning. He was in cardiac tamponade. Sarah's voice was even. I performed a pericardiocentesis. His vital signs stabilized. He's heading to the OR for formal intervention. Hargrove leaned forward. You performed an invasive cardiac procedure without physician supervision. You were asleep. Still even. Still flat. He was dying. Sarah is a night shift nurse. Hargrove's voice carried that particular tone of someone delivering unfortunate news to unfortunate people. Competent, certainly. But not trained in emergency cardiology. This was reckless. This was cowboy medicine. And it exposes Oak Creek to catastrophic liability. Brennan was taking notes. His pen moved with the steady rhythm of someone billing $800 an hour. Yost frowned. But the patient survived. He's stable, isn't he? This time. Hargrove made that sound like a concession in a chess match he was still winning. But I've been documenting concerning behavior for months. Paranoia. Questioning routine medication orders. Insubordination. I believe Sarah is experiencing some kind of psychological break. I've reviewed her employment file. There are significant gaps. 3 years completely unaccounted for before she came to Oak Creek. No references from that period. Nothing. The room shifted. Yost and Hammond exchanged glances. Brennan's pen kept moving. Sarah's hands were folded in her lap. Very still. That's concerning, Hammond said quietly. Where were you during those 3 years, Ms. Chen? She didn't answer. The silence in the room stretched like pulled taffy. You could hear the air conditioning hum. The distant sound of a monitor beeping down the hall. The fluorescent lights buzzing with that electrical drone that lived in every hospital in America. Hargrove pulled out his phone. I contacted her previous employer. They were reluctant to discuss details, of course, but I was able to piece together some information. Personal crisis. Instability. They noted several concerning incidents. He turned to Rodriguez. Combined with her behavior here, I believe she's a liability to patient safety. Brennan's pen stopped. Then resumed. The tempo had changed. Faster now. Rodriguez's face had that pained expression of someone who had already voted and was now simply going through the motions of the vote. Sarah, I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave pending a formal investigation into the incident in room 12, Rodriguez said. The hospital's liability team will need to review your actions. You'll need to surrender your badge and access card. Still. Sarah didn't move. Didn't react. The composure of someone who had survived worse than this. Someone who understood that the only power you had in a room like this was the power to refuse them the satisfaction of your break. Staff Sergeant Reeves would be dead, she said quietly. That may be, Brennan said. His voice was the color of silk over steel. But hospital protocol exists for a reason. There will be a hearing. The walk to her locker felt like moving underwater. The night shift was ending. The day shift was arriving. People she'd worked with for 3 years nodded at her, the small, careful nods of people who had already decided not to be associated with whatever was happening. Her locker was small. Everything she owned in this life fit in a space designed for spare clothes and a lunch bag. The thermos. Scratched aluminum, the lid held together with electrical tape. 12 years old. Carried through Kandahar, Jalabad, the Persian Gulf, and 1,000 quiet nights in a mid-sized Georgia hospital where she'd planned to disappear. The succulent in its ceramic pot. Dying. She'd been trying to keep it alive for 6 months and it had been winning the entire time. The porcelain mug. Chipped. It said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. A white elephant gift from a secret Santa for years ago. She'd kept it because no one else wanted it. Kindred spirit. At the bottom of the locker, wrapped in a piece of desert camouflage fabric she'd saved from her time in Ramadi, were the boots. Combat boots. Issued 2009. Worn through 3 deployments. The sole on the left boot was separating. The laces were still the original tan color, faded to the shade of old paper. The leather was cracked. There was still dust in the seams. Real dust. From a real place. From the time before this time. She pulled the fabric around them and placed them on top of everything else. Janet helped her carry the box to the exit. By 4:15 p.m., Sarah was at a bus stop on Victory Drive. The rain had arrived the way rain arrives in Savannah, not falling so much as exhaling from the sky. The box balanced on her hip felt lighter and heavier at the same time. She looked down at the plant. The leaves had darkened from the moisture. The soil was soaked through. She'd killed it. Even in trying to keep it alive, she'd managed to kill it. The photo of her son in dress blues was curling at the edges, the image starting to warp from the humidity. Her phone was in her pocket. It had notifications. Text messages from people who used to call her by her first name. An email from hospital HR about her exit interview. Nothing from Hargrove. He didn't need to say anything. He'd already said everything. The rain hammered the sidewalk like applause for a performance nobody wanted to attend. She stood there for 7 minutes. Just stood. Watched the rain. Felt the weight of the cardboard box. Felt the shape of the combat boots through the fabric. A bus pulled up. Number 42. Heading north. She didn't get on. She just stood there, watching the taillights disappear into the rain, understanding with perfect clarity that everything she'd built in 3 years had crumbled in the time it took to save a man's life. The irony of that wasn't lost on her. The cruelty of that wasn't lost on her either. But what neither Sarah nor anyone at Oak Creek Memorial understood yet was that sometimes the moment you become invisible is the moment someone else's eyes finally open. Sometimes the moment you're pushed out of the light is the moment someone walks in carrying proof of exactly who you are. Staff Sergeant Reeves was in the operating room. His surgeon, a genuine cardiothoracic surgeon, the kind with letters after his name and papers published in journals, was draining the pericardium. And while the scalpel worked, Reeves' son was making phone calls. To his commanding officer. To his battalion commander. To the people who kept track of people like Sarah Chen. Because you don't forget the person who saved your father's life. You don't forget the competence. The precision. The way someone moves through crisis like they've been trained for something bigger than what the rest of the world sees them doing. And sometimes, just sometimes, there are people who have the authority to ask the questions that change everything. The rain fell sideways at the bus stop on Victory Drive, and Sarah Chen stood with a cardboard box balanced on her hip like she'd carried a rifle for 23 years. She had. The box contained everything: a coffee mug with a chipped handle, a stethoscope she could no longer use, and a photograph of her son in dress blues that curled at the edges as water darkened the leaves of a half-dead succulent from her locker. The porcelain mug clinked against the stethoscope with each shift of her weight, a sound like small defeat. A car passed, its tires hissing on wet asphalt, and Sarah didn't look up. She'd been trained to observe without appearing to observe, but there was nothing left to observe. Oak Creek Memorial was already behind her, a place where she'd walked for years trying to be no one. The rain hammered down like applause for something she hadn't earned. Not yet. 3 days later, an ambulance arrived under federal guard. The call came through dispatch at 4:17 p.m. Transfer patient from the federal detention facility, Khalid al-Rashid, former insurgent commander extradited for testimony against his network, septic shock, organs shutting down. The admission board lit up orange. Ellen Rodriguez texted Sarah before she'd finished reading the message, "Don't. Just don't." But Sarah had already looked up the manifesto. Al-Rashid was the last piece of the Ramadi puzzle, the one who'd ordered the ambush that killed 8 Marines on September 17, 2009. The one who'd ordered Michael to die. The one who'd almost succeeded. Sarah called Oak Creek at 5:22 p.m. The switchboard transferred her to Rodriguez, who'd stayed on nights and become something like a friend. "You can visit as a civilian," Rodriguez said, her voice pitched low like she was saying something dangerous. "But you cannot work." Hargrove left explicit orders. "He's on call tonight." Sarah arrived in street clothes at 8:15 p.m. Her hands felt strange without latex, her pockets empty without her hospital badge. The visitor's pass they gave her was neon yellow, the color of temporary. She went to Reeves' room first. Staff Sergeant Dylan Reeves was awake, sitting up, his color returning like someone learning to breathe again. His mother sat in the chair beside his bed, knitting needles clicking, a rhythmic pulse like a medic's metronome. His mother looked at Sarah and saw a visitor, just another tired-looking woman in street clothes. Then Sarah heard the code from the next room. The monitors were screaming. A ventilator wheezed in distress. She moved toward the sound the way muscle memory moved, before thought, before protocol, before fear. A federal agent stood at the doorway, bulk of him, hands resting on a belt loaded with authority. "No badge," he said. "No entry." Sarah watched over his shoulder. Al-Rashid was crashing hard. BP 68/42 and tanking. The evening nurse fumbled with medications, her hands moving in patterns that would fail. Dr. Hargrove was 20 minutes out. The monitor showed sinus tachycardia climbing toward 168. The fall line was infiltrated, fluid was pooling in the tissue instead of the vein. Sarah's grip on the doorframe left impressions like forensics. The federal agent's radio crackled. "Stand down. Let her through." Someone higher up had made a call. Sarah didn't ask who. She entered the room like she was walking into her own bones. Her hands moved. Lines placed with the precision of someone who'd done this under mortars, peripheral 4 in the left arm at 18 gauge, central line kit opened, the skin prepped with chlorhexidine, the needle going in between the collarbone and first rib at 45 degrees, skin popping as the Seldinger wire slid home. 2 liters of normal saline running wide open through a level 1 rapid infuser. Pressors calculated, norepinephrine pushed at 0.3 micrograms per kilogram per minute, titrated up as the systolic pressure refused to climb. Antibiotics, piperacillin tazobactam hanging, fluconazole for the fungal sepsis she could read in his labs just from looking at the pattern of organ shutdown. Al-Rashid stabilized in 11 minutes. As his fever broke over the next 2 hours and his eyes focused for the first time since arrival, he looked at Sarah. His voice was a rasp, broken English, words that came from somewhere deep and true. "You. Ramadi. The chief." Sarah's hands froze above the infusion pump. "You pulled me from rubble," Al-Rashid whispered. "You gave water. You said, 'Not today.'" The federal agent stepped closer. Sarah's pulse was moving through her temples like a helicopter blade. Al-Rashid's eyes widened as recognition crystallized. He'd been the ambush commander. She'd been the one who extracted his body from the collapse building where his own men had left him to die. She'd given him water from her canteen when he was screaming. She'd told him, "Not today, not under my watch," because that was what medics did. They didn't choose whose blood belonged on their hands. They chose to keep hands moving. Staff Sergeant Reeves heard the commotion from the next room. He pressed the call button, and when his nurse arrived, he didn't ask. He ordered, "Get me a phone. Now." The silence stretched like skin too tight. The federal agent's radio crackled with encrypted chatter. Sarah watched the monitor climb, O2 sat rising, blood pressure stabilizing, a human body returning from the edge of nothing. She was still the one who'd saved him. She was still the senior chief. The rain continued outside, hammering the hospital windows like it had something important to say. Staff Sergeant Jacob Reeves arrived at 9:31 p.m. in Marine dress uniform, his father's jaw, his father's eyes, his father's gift for moving with purpose. He walked past the nurse's station without stopping, found Sarah in the ICU hallway, and came to attention, spine straight, shoulders back, the kind of posture that announces someone knows the value of standing tall. "Senior Chief," he said, and the words dropped like ordnance into the silence. Ellen Rodriguez froze mid-keystroke. A nurse at the medication cart turned. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as if responding to the pressure change. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen," Jacob continued, his voice parade ground clear, each word a formation. The hallway was becoming a gathering place. Board members were emerging from the back offices. Dr. Hargrove stood at the break room door, coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. "United States Navy, Special Warfare Medical Division, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon." Jacob's voice didn't waver, didn't offer apology or explanation. Statement of fact. Statement of record. A clipboard dropped. The sound was louder than it should have been. At 10:05 p.m., Lieutenant Commander Patricia Vance walked through the ICU doors in khakis so crisp they could cut, ribbons on her chest bright as accusations. She carried a file folder with red classified stamps. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop as federal authority entered the room like cold front moving through a pressure system. Senior Chief Chen earned the Silver Star for actions in Ramadi, September 2009, Vance said, and her voice was the kind of voice that made people stand taller or step back. Under sustained enemy fire, extraction of 12 wounded Marines from an ambush position. Actions beyond the call of duty. Dr. Hargrove's face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug in his chest. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, Vance continued, opening the file. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat V Meritorious Service Medal. Purple Heart, twice wounded. Board members Yost and Hammond emerged from the elevator. Sarah watched them arrive as if walking into their own irrelevance. Vance read from the file, her words precise and devastating. On September 17, 2009, under sustained enemy fire, Senior Chief Chen extracted 12 wounded Marines from an ambush site while herself wounded. She performed battlefield surgery under mortar attack. 8 lives that should have been lost were saved. Vance's eyes moved to Al-Rashid's room. The federal prisoner in this hospital recognized her because she treated him after his capture. She gave him water when his own men left him to die. Her actions led directly to intelligence that prevented for terrorist attacks and saved 43 American lives. Jacob Reeves' voice cracked slightly, barely perceptible, but Sarah heard it. A young man breaking, "My brother Michael died in her arms in Ramadi." She carried him 300 meters under fire. She was the last voice he heard. Sarah's hands trembled as the classified file was placed in her palms. Not because she was frightened. Not because she was breaking. The trembling was something else entirely, the kind of tremor that comes from holding restraint for so long it becomes a weapon sharper than any blade. Her hands had held Michael Reeves as his blood became information, became data, became part of the price paid in a war that nobody talked about anymore. These hands had given water to the man trying to kill them. These hands had done the mathematics of survival while hospitals in Georgia had called her a nurse who'd overstepped protocol. Dr. Hargrove opened his mouth. "I didn't." Lieutenant Commander Vance held up one hand. "Dr. Hargrove, the Federal Bureau of Investigation would like to speak with you about falsified personnel files and fraudulent incident reports filed against federal personnel." The ICU went so silent they could hear the ventilators breathing, the mechanical rhythm of machines keeping people alive, the same way Sarah had kept people alive for 23 years, under fire, under pressure, under the weight of knowing that every breath she took was a breath someone else might not. The rain continued outside, but Sarah wasn't standing at a bus stop anymore. The cardboard box with her son's photograph was no longer in her hands, and when she looked at Staff Sergeant Jacob Reeves standing at attention in dress uniform, she understood that some identities never truly belong to the world. Some identities belong to the ones who'd seen the worst and chosen to give everything anyway. The Navy SEAL liaison officer arrived at Oak Creek Memorial within the hour, his uniform sharp enough to cut glass, his bearing the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. He moved through the corridors with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. His name was Captain James Holloway, and he carried with him a single manila folder and the weight of institutional authority that made the hospital's administrative staff straighten their spines without knowing why. Sarah stood at the medication station on the 3rd floor when she saw him ascending the stairwell. She didn't know who he was yet, but she recognized the signature, the way he moved like a weapon put away but not disarmed, the way the air pressure seemed to change in his presence. She kept her hand steady on the 4 bags she was checking, the fluorescent lights humming their electric song above her head. Dr. Hargrove was already in the boardroom when Holloway entered. Ellen Rodriguez sat across from him, along with 3 board members and a hospital attorney whose name tag read Patricia Swanson. The coffee cups were cold. Nobody had moved in 40 minutes. The silence in that room was so thick you could have sutured in it. Captain Holloway didn't shake hands. He opened the manila folder and laid 3 pages on the conference table. His voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, low, controlled, with the kind of certainty that didn't require volume. Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Elizabeth Chen. Naval Medical Corps. Assigned to Naval Special Warfare Development Group, 2019 to 2022. 3 operational theaters: Kandahar Province, Jalabad Valley, and Ramadi. He paused, Let that settle. She was embedded with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines as a direct action medic. Her first citation. He tapped the second page. Silver Star. Awarded for extraordinary heroism under fire during a combat extraction. 12 wounded Marines. 200 meters of open ground. Sustained enemy fire from 3 positions. Hargrove's coffee cup remained frozen an inch from his lips. That extraction took 4 minutes. All 12 Marines returned alive. The room didn't breathe. Second citation. Holloway's voice remained level, almost conversational. Bronze Star with Valor. Fallujah, December 2020. Convoy ambush. 17 casualties across 2 vehicles. She performed emergency damage control resuscitation on 9 soldiers simultaneously. In a burning truck. While returning fire with a 9mm Beretta. He turned to Hargrove directly. She saved 7 of 9. The other 2 were gone before the round stopped. Dr. Hargrove's face had drained of color, the way a body does when the blood forgets which direction it's supposed to travel. Third citation. Bronze Star with Valor. Jalabad Valley, May 2021. Forward operating base taking indirect fire. She was off duty. She ran toward the mortars, not away from them. Pulled for soldiers from a collapsed structure. One had catastrophic hemorrhage from a compound fracture to both legs. She performed a field amputation with surgical shears and a Kershaw combat knife. Cauterized the bleeding with a microwave-activated hemostatic dressing. Holloway closed the folder. His eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic. That soldier is alive. Teaching high school in Portland now. Has 2 daughters. The board members' faces had gone pale. Patricia Swanson's pen had stopped moving mid-sentence on her legal pad. Senior Chief Chen walked away from active duty in 2022 following completion of her service contract. The Navy Records Office shows 0 psychiatric episodes, 0 disciplinary actions, and a commendation from Admiral Michael Grant stating she was the finest combat medic this command has ever trained. Holloway stood. I was sent here because someone tried to falsify her medical credentials and obstruct her civilian employment. That someone is in this room. He looked directly at Hargrove. You've got about 2 minutes before the FBI parking lot fills up. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, Ellen Rodriguez's face had transformed into something that resembled understanding and rage in equal measure. Patricia Swanson stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the linoleum like a scream. One of the board members whispered something that sounded like "though God" under his breath. Dr. Hargrove's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse frame by frame, and he was powerless to stop it. 2 FBI agents arrived at 6:45 a.m. on day 72. Agent Lisa Torres had the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years piecing together white-collar crime, and Agent Mark Chen, no relation to Sarah, carried a laptop the way other men carried weapons. They waited by Hargrove's office with the patience of hunters who knew their prey would come to them. He arrived at 7:33 a.m., coffee in hand, briefcase swinging, completely unaware they were there until Torres stepped forward. Dr. Marcus Hargrove, FBI. We need to discuss your hospital records management practices. His smile was reflexive, the kind a drowning man gives before the water closes over his head. I'm sure this is a misunderstanding. Agent Chen opened the laptop. You attempted to access Senior Chief Chen's personnel file on November 8 and insert fabricated psychological evaluations dated to 2022. You altered incident reports from October 14, October 29, and November 3 to inflate the severity of her clinical actions. You contacted Naval Medical Center San Diego, impersonating a civilian hospital administrator to obtain confidential employment information. Chen's voice was flat, clinical, the voice of a man who'd already decided your guilt and was simply reciting the evidence for the record. You prescribed vancomycin at 2,500 milligrams per infusion on September 22. The nephrotoxic threshold is 1,800. Senior Chief Chen caught it. She reported it. You then filed an incident report claiming she had administered the wrong dose. Hargrove's coffee cup began to tremble in his hand, the liquid inside beginning a small earthquake. Torres stepped closer. The hospital's IT director confirmed all edits are time-stamped. You accessed the system from your home IP address at 11:51 p.m. on November 8th. 40 minutes after Staff Sergeant Reeves' cardiac emergency. The timing matters, Dr. Hargrove, because it shows intent. You knew what she'd done that night. You knew she'd saved his life. And you decided she needed to disappear. His lawyer arrived at 8:15 a.m., already objecting. Ronald Kessler, a man whose suit cost more than most people's monthly rent, immediately began screaming about procedural violations and entrapment and civil rights infringement. The words came out like bullets with no targets. At 9:13 a.m., in the parking lot outside Oak Creek Memorial, the media cameras began to flash. Agent Torres read the charges in a voice that carried across the asphalt like a judgment: falsifying federal medical records, obstruction of justice, healthcare fraud, and conspiracy to commit defamation. The handcuffs clicked shut with the finality of a closing door. Hargrove's face had turned red, not the red of shame but the red of a man whose world had inverted and he was falling through it. His lawyer screamed, but the screaming was the sound of a man with no ground beneath his feet. Sarah watched from a third-floor window, arms crossed, her expression neutral as a stone. Ellen Rodriguez stood beside her, shaking her head slowly. Sarah, the board wants to reinstate you. Full salary. Back pay for the administrative leave. And they want to issue a formal written apology. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She watched the FBI vehicle pull away with Hargrove in the back, his head turned away from the cameras. Finally, she said, I need to think about it. That night, she visited Staff Sergeant Reeves. He was sitting up now, color returning to his face like someone remembering how to live. His mother had gone home to rest. The cardiac monitor beside him beeped its steady rhythm, 103 beats per minute, climbing toward normal. He looked at Sarah for a long moment, the kind of moment that stretches and holds weight. Michael talked about you, Reeves said. His voice was still rough, still finding its way back from the edge. Called you the chief who walked through fire. Sarah's jaw tightened. She didn't move. She didn't look away. I didn't save him, she said. You tried. That's why he loved you. Sarah nodded once, a single gesture of acknowledgement that spanned 3 years of grief. She turned to leave. The linoleum felt soft under her shoes. Reeves called after her, he'd want you to stay. Do what you do. Save the ones you can. Sarah paused at the doorway but didn't turn around. She let the word settle into the place where she kept her son, not in her mind, but in the bone-deep quiet of her center. Then she kept walking. 6 months later, Sarah walked past a strip mall on Highway 80, 3 miles from Oak Creek Memorial. The rain began as she passed a storefront window wedged between Quick Tax Solutions and Phone Repair Guy. Inside, at a folding table with a polyester tablecloth that had once been white but had faded to the color of old teeth, sat Dr. Marcus Hargrove. He wore a rumpled polo shirt with a coffee stain on the left pocket and sold supplemental insurance policies to anyone who'd listen. A handwritten banner behind him read, Affordable coverage, ask me how. His medical license was revoked. His name was a cautionary tale in hospital ethics seminars across the Southeast. A middle-aged woman sat across from him, checking her phone, clearly uninterested. Hargrove was talking anyway, the patter of a man trying to convince the world he still mattered. Nobody was listening. Sarah slowed but didn't stop. The rain fell harder, tapping against the storefront glass like applause. She let herself smile, just slightly, just enough to feel it happen, and kept walking. In her shoulder bag, wrapped carefully in desert camouflage, her son Michael's combat boots felt a little lighter than they had in 3 years. The boots he'd worn in Ramadi. The boots that had walked through fire. She was back at Oak Creek Memorial now, running the ICU night shift, training new nurses in battlefield triage techniques they'd probably never need but might save a life. Staff Sergeant Dylan Reeves had recovered fully and returned to active duty. He wrote her every month, short letters on official Navy stationery, telling her about his family, his daughter's soccer team, the weight of command. His son Jacob visited when he was stateside, always stood a little straighter in her presence, the way young soldiers do around someone they know has walked through things they haven't imagined yet. The succulent on her locker shelf had new growth, bright green against the old yellow. The chipped mug held pens now, not tea. The photo of Michael in dress blue sat on her desk, no longer curling at the edges. Every night shift, before she put on her scrubs, she looked at that photo for exactly 5 seconds. No more. No less. She arrived at the hospital at 10:45 p.m. The rain had stopped. Stars pierced the Georgia sky like puncture wounds in the fabric of everything. She badged in, checked the board, saw 3 critical patients and 2 post-op Marines transferred from the VA. Her hands were steady. She took 4 measured breaths, the way she'd learned in Kandahar when the mortars fell and there was no time to be afraid, only time to work. Then she went to work, because some wars don't end. They just change theaters. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.